everybody, and welcome to the first of this term's Oxford Martin School seminars, which are on the theme of turning to the crowd. I'm Chris Lintott. I'm co-director here of the programme on computational cosmology. And if you think there's a large jump between computational cosmology and today's speakers, I hope that by the end of the session you'll be convinced otherwise. I ought to know this particular group of eminent researchers because of my own work, which features, as many of you will know, what we call citizen science, but the involvement of hundreds of thousands of volunteers online in tasks such as classifying galaxies, helping us sort out pictures of animals in the Serengeti, or even looking at images of disasters and natural disasters in an effort to provide live feedback to teams on the ground. And this all seemed very new and exciting. The word citizen science in this context doesn't appear in the literature until sort of somewhere around 2001. The first projects were NASA projects looking at the surface of Mars. And under the broader title of crowdsourcing, you find it popping up in the business literature at around about the same time. But of course, the idea of citizen involvement, of volunteer involvement, of amateur involvement in the research process is an old one. It can be traced right back to the beginnings of science. And in particular, as we'll hear today, it was an idea that flourished in the 19th century in particular. So when we came to think about how to build Zooniverse, our platform for 21st century crowdsourcing, in an effort to solve some of the problems that are being addressed by researchers here at the Martin School, it seemed obvious that in order to understand how to communicate with a large crowd of volunteers, we should look backwards and try and learn from historians what had worked and what hadn't worked in the past. Of course, one thing that hasn't really changed is that even the most exciting academic research needs support, and you'll see from the slide on the screen that we were grateful to the Arts and Humanities Research Council, who have just given us a grant to investigate exactly this question, the construction of scientific communities, both online today and as a topic of historical research in the 19th century. So we have three speakers today. Two of them will talk about specific instances of what we now might call citizen science, drawn from the 19th century. But before that, we're going to have a general introduction and an overview of the topic. The first speaker is Professor Sally Shuttleworth, who's a professor in the English department here, and an eminent historian and expert, an eminent professor of English, of course, and an expert in scientific periodicals in particular. So Sally, over to you.
You see, I'm a speaker on high-tech things, but with not high-tech props, and I've got nowhere to put my papers. I'm speaking from hand notes. So, the title of my talk, or the general panel, is Dear Mr Darwin, What Can We Learn from the 19th Century Science? Now, the project, as Chris was mentioning, is a joint project funded by the AHRC on constructing scientific communities, citizen science in the 19th and 21st century. And it's joint between University of Oxford and Leicester, but also with the Natural History Museum, the Royal College of Surgeons, and the Royal Society. The premise behind the project is that there are very strong parallels between the huge growth in citizen science projects now and those that happened in the 19th century, a time when the barriers and divisions between what, for want of a better word, I'll call amateurs and professionals, were not yet set. And when armies of individuals participated in natural history societies, field clubs, took meteorological readings, or campaigned for improved public health. And a lot of this activity was mediated through the periodical press. The information revolution of our own age has parallels in the 19th century, which saw an explosion of print and of journal publishing. That in 1800, there were around 100 scientific periodicals published. But by 1900, this had jumped to 10,000 scientific periodicals. And despite, I should say, the current digitation programs, only a tiny fraction of these periodicals are yet digitized, and most have never received any scholarly attention. So there's huge, wonderful hinterland talking about the involvement between the amateur and professional in science, which has just never been looked at historically. So drawing on these journals, we're looking at the ways in which patterns of popular communication engagement in the 19th century can offer models for current practice in citizen science. Now, when Darwin was developing his theories of evolution, he read avidly in popular natural history magazines and sought out information from an army of almost 2,000 correspondents, many of whom he approached having read their little contributions to natural history journals, having noted that in Sedbergh something happened. So he writes back and says, "Please tell me about the otter you saw in the river." Now, with his canonization as a man of grand science, it's easy to forget that his roots were very much in this strong amateur tradition. The places in which he chose to publish his work are very telling. So his first publication in 1836, which was also with Fitzroy, was in the South African Christian Reader. And you can note as he publishes that he starts to move up the scale a bit. So you then have publications in the Proceedings of the Geological Society, the Zoological Society, and the Entomological Society, all of which had recently been founded. But then you get Annals of Natural History. Then, highlight here, 1839, he makes it to the Philtrans. But then, very soon afterwards, he's publishing in the Penny magazine of the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge in 1840. Then you find him, 1841, he's writing on humblebees for the Gardener's Chronicle. And he continues to write in the Gardener's Chronicle for the rest of his career. So, even after the publication of The Origin in 1859, you find him publishing, for example, in The Cottage Gardener and Country Gentleman in 1860, or The Field, or another one that is a favourite of the project, Hardwick's Science Gossip. And he also uses these periodicals to ask for information from the contributors. Thus, in 1857, in Gardener's Chronicle, he writes an article on mouse-coloured breed of ponies, and he uses the article to ask breeders who are reading the magazine if they can send him in information. Or similarly, in 1866, he writes an article on the feet of otterhounds in the magazine for Country Gentlemen, Land and Water. And again, he's appealing for any readers who have any information that they can give to him on otterhounds. So he's running, in other words, his own highly labour-intensive network of citizen science. In creating his theories on the origins of species, he was deeply dependent on the expertise of cattle breeders, pigeon fanciers, gardeners, and amateur naturalists. From the 1830s, you have an explosion of these periodicals for the amateur audience, and also the formation of a range of societies, all designed to try and raise up the general knowledge base and interaction with science in the country. Thus, you've got the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, who produced the Penny magazine that Darwin published in, which was instigated by Lord Henry Brougham from 1826, or the founding of the Mechanics' Institutes from the 1820s. And then from the 1830s onwards, you get, first of all, from the Berwickshire Naturalist Club, and then throughout the country, the development of natural history societies and field clubs across the country. There is a big scholarly debate about how much this is enthusiasm from the bottom up and how much pressure from on high to educate the populace. But it's quite clear that a lot of the enthusiasm and the development was actually in the lower classes, as they designated them then. One of the strengths of these natural history societies in particular was that they were devoted to a detailed study of the local area. That's in the first volume of the Wiltshire Archaeological and Natural History magazine. They talk about how they took their inspiration from a work by Sir John Herschel, The Discourse on the Study of Natural Philosophy, where he argues for the infinite advantages of the local observer. And they conclude It is to the increased number of such local cultivators of science enjoying these peculiar opportunities that he ascribes the immense progress made of late years in the physical sciences, a progress which in its advance cannot but entail, as Herschel goes to remark, incalculable benefits upon mankind. There is an unbroken tradition of amateur naturalists recording species diversity in their local areas, studying the geology, studying the patterns of the plants and animals that they find. And it's very interesting to note that the record of species diversity is still in amateur hands, but very much helped by the Natural History Museum. And here we are working directly with the Angela Marmont Centre for UK Biodiversity, which is the arm of the Natural History Museum that works with amateur naturalists. And part of our project is actually going to be working with current amateur communities to design an experiment that will be conducted and guided by them and then analysed online by other citizen scientists as a way of cutting out the top-down professional scientist imposing scientific structure. Now, another very strong area of citizen science in the 19th century was meteorology. Here there was a strong tradition going back to the 18th century, but in the mid-19th century it became a nationally organised network. And here I'm drawing to some degree on the excellent book on the subject, Predicting the Weather by Catherine Anderson. And she draws a contrast between James Glaisher, who worked at Greenwich and from 1844 supplied the meteorological data to the General Register Office and had 50 trained observers, but in complete contrast with someone called George James Simmons, who created, virtually single-handedly, the British Rainfall Organisation. So this is one of the first volumes here. We see his beautifully constructed map, and he created observers all over the country. So that by 1900, when he finally stopped, so he moves from the early 1860s right to 1900, maintaining this extraordinary network, he'd gone up to 3,400 recording stations across the UK. So here's frontispiece for an 1880 version. So, and I included this. This is a letter to the Times he wrote, where he suggests that he has to use the Times because he wishes to have observers in out-of-the-way places, and you can hardly think of any other way of reaching them other than via the Times. And then if you note down at the bottom, he's saying that there's going to be no problems, no costs. He will actually supply gauges to people if they need them. But then he concludes by saying, neither is there any difficulty in observing, for my correspondents are of both sexes, all ages, and all classes. So a wonderfully inclusive vision of who these citizen scientists might be. And I include another, this is part of an introduction to the 1881 version, where he's talking about his citizen science network. So he says, I am myself astonished at the magnitude of this amateur organisation, without either state aid, magniloquent title, managing council, or pecuniary resources, except the voluntary contributions of the staff. A staff where the members rarely see one another, and still more rarely see their chief, and as it resides all over the place, who include nearly every social grade, from peer to peasant, and yet who, with exceptions so rare that they take me by surprise, work with a regularity and heartiness which is beyond praise. Why do they do it? Minor motives may have some influence, but I believe that the leading sentiment which binds together British rainfall observers is the consciousness that they are helping gradually to store up a mass of information which is and will yearly become increasingly valuable to the nation at large, in relation alike to agriculture, sanitation, and the proper appropriation of the water supply of the British Isles. So this magnificent vision of how they're contributing basically to the progress of the country. And I should note that wonderfully, his rainfall observations are now all digitised and on the Meteorological Office's website, should you wish to peruse them. And around this time, a government department wished to take him over, and he absolutely refused, said, no, We are amateurs. This is the spirit that leads us. And should we become part of a soulless department, the life would go out of us. So he insisted on maintaining their amateur status. So I move now, he suggests at the end that it's linked to sanitation. And there was a very strong tie-up between the huge interest in sanitary and public health matters and meteorology in the 19th century, and often it was the same people taking the measurements. It was also an area where they had a huge accumulation of data during the 19th century, as you had people scattered across the country taking weekly readings. And I have an example here of the Sanitary Review and Journal of Public Health, edited by the wonderful sanitary reformer Benjamin Ward Richardson, who invented the slogan, which you can see across there. And this is Hygeia, the goddess of health. National health is national wealth. So if only our government would listen. I'll offer you also, I've just found this, a wonderful cartoon from Punch of the famous Dr. Richardson being retorted. He believed that you should pump out ozone everywhere to make everybody healthy. So this is a humorous vision for the populace. But what I want to turn to is an article that he wrote for the journal, The Registration of Disease in England in 1858. In this article, he's arguing for a complete registration of disease right across the country. Later on, he was to argue that not only should you record human disease, but you should also record animal and plant disease. The notion that if everybody tracked through every borough of the country the ways in which these diseases moved, you'd be able to fully understand the spread of epidemics and across species chains. And he was told that he was 50 years before his time, but as we know, nothing has happened on this front, but could be very, very promising should it be brought in this late. Now, in this article, he's focusing on the study of epidemics, and he compares the backwardness in the study of disease to the advanced methods of the astronomer, who were constantly taken, Chris will be pleased to hear, as the model for how one should do science. He insists that you need to study disease, not merely when it is there, but also when it is absent. We've often thought that if the eclipses of the sun and moon had always been observed in the same manner as physicians observe transient diseases, the nature of an eclipse would have remained as yet an unsolved problem. So he insists that you need patient and regular study and understanding of the laws which relate part to whole. And he lays down 4 elements for the study of disease. 1, the whole competent mental strength of the district or county in which the epidemic exists. 2, uniformity in the system of observation. 3, a ready and easy mode of recording observations in a simple and scientific manner. And 4, a properly constituted plan by which the facts observed may be at once collected and submitted to analysis and publication. Very much the rules that one would draw up now, I think, for trying to manage a large data project. But I go back to that first point when he talks very intriguingly of the whole competent mental strength of the district. What does he mean by this? I got my hopes up, but they were slightly dashed when I discovered he didn't mean every single human being within the district, but actually the medical health officers. Nonetheless, there were hundreds of them across the UK, but it didn't include children and it didn't include women. But a sense that there was across the UK this diverse body who would be able to undertake these very detailed organisation analyses. And I just want to read a little bit from his concluding remarks, where he talks about how one needs to look at historical records. He talks about the documents you can find in cellars. Pile upon pile, mouldering away among dust and rubbish in the cellars of workhouses and in the surgeries of medical men, lie what might become the greatest records of disease ever published, the veritable histories which government has sporadically sought after at great pains, great cost and little advantage. Sometimes these documents are sold as waste paper, and instead of fulfilling their legitimate and useful objects, are turned to the clothing of perishable butter and briny bacon. Surely this veritable outspreading of pearls before dead swine ought not to continue. So there's a wonderful graphic vision here of the importance of the historical document. And he's recommending really construction of the archives of disease. And I think this is very parallel to some of the work that Zooniverse is doing in its historical projects at the moment, transforming mouldering records into new forms of science. So astronomy, natural history, meteorology, sanitary science laid the foundations for more diverse forms of citizen science later in the century. One aspect was Francis Galton going around testing everybody he could possibly lay his hands on, and offering a life history album to people, which interestingly wasn't just going to record their illnesses and their size and weight, etc., but also how diet affected their health, when they moved, what their occupation was, how much stress they had. So this notion that building up an extraordinary in-depth mass observation, of course it did not take hold in every household, but did build up very, very interesting documentation. But I want to end on the note of the child study movement of the 1880s and 90s, which is a very interesting development because it moved from starting with Darwin, in fact, and his study of his own child, which then became a movement in evolutionary psychology and biology, and then filtered through to teachers and to parents. And so you got a huge movement, all based upon studying the child. And there's one wonderfully humorous article from a psychologist, Sully, who talks about the ways in which the father has suddenly become very interested in his baby. So the tiny occupant of the cradle has had to bear the piercing glance of the scientific eye. The psychological papa has acquired a new propriety right in his offspring. He has appropriated it as a biological specimen. Now, I end with this example because what it produced were incredible territory wars. Because in order to get access to this data, the male scientist or the father has actually to have access to the nursery, which is controlled by the nursemaid, by the wife, who was not very keen on having their baby subjected to scientific experiment and measurement. And there was a real battle as to who was qualified both to observe and also who to interpret information. And in the British Child Study Association and their journal, you find scientists writing saying that you should as well ask a mother to study her own child as an African to study a fetish. And suggesting that women absolutely could not study and were not qualified. And then you get mothers writing back to say, no, we are the best qualified to be able to study our babies. And so what it's doing is drawing attention to the boundaries between the professional and the amateur. So the boundaries in the 19th century were less secure, but there were constant struggles with who was qualified to observe. It was not simply a seamless web from amateur to professional. And there was also, as I've suggested, the problem of nomenclature. What do you call these people who aren't professionals, but it seems wrong to call them amateurs? Simmons, interestingly, uses the term authorities for his citizen scientist. But I'd like to conclude just with a reference of the possibilities suggested in present-day science, with reference to an article that was published in the Royal Society Journal, the Biology Letters, in 2011, on black autumn bees. And you probably heard about this in the media. It was an experiment that was in part designed, conducted, and also written up by primary school children. And it created not a stampede, I have to say, of followers in the scientific community, but suggests many ways, I think, in which it's possible to what can happen if you think creatively and open up science to citizens. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sally, for getting us off to an excellent start. We're going to take questions for all the speakers at the end, so we can have a more general discussion there. There will be plenty of time. It's fascinating that Simmons is answering the question that we in the Zooniverse get asked all the time, which is, why would these people do this? And giving an answer that we give, which is that they just want to contribute to knowledge. But also those issues about who owns the data and the right to research come up in modern day projects like 23andMe and Patients Like Me, where people are fighting for the right to be researchers with their own medical data and with their own genomic data, and also we have issues of how to share that data so that researchers can get access to it in the privacy of their own labs. And so it's appropriate that we're going to turn to medicine next. And our next speaker is Dr. Sally Frampton, a postdoctoral researcher on the project based at St Anne's. Her previous work reveals her as an expert in medical knowledge making, in particular in the history of surgery. But she's going to talk today about citizen medicine. Sally.
So perhaps I can begin by probing a bit further what we actually mean by citizen science. So I think in the first instance, we obviously looked at projects like Zooniverse, where crowdsourcing techniques are being employed to collect large amounts of data, and I think really demonstrate with great success how interest in science beyond the professional realm is being successfully harnessed and is enabling better and more productive scientific practice. And as we've seen, these methods of data collection, they have deep and historical significant roots, as Sally has discussed. But of course, the meaning and definition of citizen science also goes beyond this. Underpinning citizen science is a relationship between experts and non-experts, which prioritises engagement between the two. A relationship which, within the scientific realm, has fluctuated and changed depending on historical context. And it's this broader understanding of citizen science which I'm using to inform my own project, which is looking at the relationship between experts and lay people in the context of medicine. So, and this is certainly a topic which is of great importance in contemporary medicine, where it can sometimes seem, I think, that the authority of the medical profession is, if not in decline, perhaps being increasingly questioned. So I'm thinking of perhaps the recent NHS scandals from Alderhay to mid-staffs, and rising expectations generally, I think, upon the health sector, often judged increasingly as a sort of a consumer sector and being judged in those terms. So I think in Britain today, medicine can seem more than ever to be shaped by the needs of the public. Patient groups, for example, play a key role in lots of organisations and institutions. Regulatory bodies like the MHRA have the Yellow Card programme, where you can report adverse experiences with medicine. And then, of course, you've got citizen science projects like Click to Cure, which is on the Zooniverse platform, where people can analyse cancer biology data. So lots of things happening. And then I think as well, the landscape has been considerably changed by the media, particularly with online participation relating to medicine. So, we have lots of medical forums where people can share their experiences of health and illness, where they can support one another. You have sites which sort of help facilitate initial diagnosis and things like that. So the dichotomy of the professional and non-professional certainly exists in medicine today, but challenges to these boundaries are, I think, quite visible. So while this might seem like a contemporary phenomenon in some senses, in the 19th century, the boundaries between the medical expert and the layperson could be contested as well. The Victorian era has often been characterised as a time when medical practitioners were becoming increasingly professionalised and becoming much more cohesive. And certainly the medical politics of the 19th century are very much centred around these questions. And during this time, we see rhetorical strategies being put into place to help distinguish medical professionals from other people who are practicing medicine. So you're probably familiar with the term quack doctor. So at this time, you see a division kind of opening up. And you have the 1858 Medical Act, for example, where you have to register if you're a qualified doctor. And you see the beginnings of lots of medical institutions and societies and things like that, which all really help reassert that group identity and culture of the medical profession. So certainly that narrative is very concrete, I think, but I think within it we sometimes lose sight of how people outside the medical profession might have contributed to the culture of medicine at this time. So I'm thinking things like vaccination, vivisection, sanitary health, which Sally had discussed. All these things attracted a great deal of interest from the public, and lots of people were contributing to knowledge and debate on these topics. And certainly in the cases of vaccination and vivisection, this extended to the mobilisation of full-scale campaigns against both practices. And I think the anti-vaccination movement in particular, which I hope to look at more in this project, had a major impact on medical culture, and is, of course, a subject which remains pertinent today. So I've included a few things. This is a caricature from 1802, so shortly after Edward Jenner started practicing vaccination, which kind of plays on people's fears about being inoculated with material from cows. And you can see people literally turning into cows in that. And this is one of the periodicals which cropped up, the Anti-Vaccinator, which is a popular anti-vaccination periodical. So the emergence of numerous weekly medical periodicals in the early decades of the 19th century, I think, played a hugely important part in this relationship. And between the 1820s and the 1840s, you have lots of the periodicals, some are familiar today, the Lancet, the BMJ, that start emerging. That these periodicals came out weekly was very important, because it enabled greater debate, enabled quicker conveyance of newsworthy events. So again, I think you can see parallels with today when we have the internet, where sort of constant update of news on Twitter and so forth. So that had a huge impact. But it also presented a paradox, because the function of the medical periodical was in part to bring together the profession, to do that cohesive thing, to reinforce that group identity, and to challenge really anything that might threaten the profession's respectability, like quack doctors, for example. And yet medical periodicals also operated in a world beyond medicine. Like all periodicals, they were circulated. They existed beyond the medical world. And the extent to which their readership could be restricted to doctors, or even whether it was desirable to do so, was a topic of great interest. So strikingly, a number of journals like the Lancet actually started off with the express intention of being available to people beyond the medical profession. So in the first issue of the Lancet in 1923, the journal's editor, Thomas Wakeley, for example, proclaimed that the journal was not just for medical and surgical practitioners, but for every individual in these realms. So he seemed to be envisioning a periodical that really would stretch beyond the medical community and an expected audience of interested citizens across the country. How far this worked out is, I don't know yet, but is something I hope to be looking into. Now, this space certainly wasn't neutral. The public's interest in medical matters could be troubling to the profession. The profession had very set ideas, I think, on how much medical knowledge there should be within the public, and the extent to which the public should be schooled in various issues. And the prevailing opinion seems to have been that some medical knowledge was good, but this essentially had to be kept in check. So we see limits, I think, here to the citizen medicine. And this is, I think, quite an interesting quote from the Lancet, which really sums up this opinion, that they're very happy that the days are gone by, that medicine is to be regarded as a mystery, that it's a great thing that you have articles on modern medicine in the lay journals, and that intelligent people are finding an interest in it. But there are limitations, that this shouldn't encourage people to study their own diseases, for example, and the idea of self-doctoring was something that they were very concerned about. So that kind of, I think, really showcases their sort of way they're thinking. And I think this is actually a really good example of how this played out. So the introduction of St John Ambulance in 1877 actually sparked quite a lot of debate within the medical periodicals, because there was a fear that this was going to lead to amateur practice. And you can see here on the left that there's a discussion of the possibility of amateur surgery. And I think surgery was used as a very evocative example, because, you know, the idea of unqualified people doing surgery is terrifying, frankly. So I think that's quite a good example. And then there's a great Punch cartoon. This is slightly later, from 1914, but it's kind of satirising the amateur medic. So Slightly unsurprisingly, it's a woman who is the amateur medic who's sort of botching this bandaging of this child and being told off by a doctor. So, despite this, I think medical periodicals of the 19th century actually provided a really important discursive space where the medical profession and lay people could interact. And it was precisely because these journals were waving the flag of medical authority that it can make them an important vehicle for lay people who wish to express their concerns about various matters. Publication in the medical periodicals meant that their concern was being taken to the profession directly through a recognised and approved channel. And it was the correspondence columns in particular that enabled this. So just for the final part of the talk, I just want to show you a couple of early examples I found in my research. This one is correspondence from an issue of The Lancet in 1827. And it recalls the plight of a woman named Sarah Newell, who'd been committed to an asylum after being declared insane by her family. And her case had been taken up by the educationist George Birkbeck, who was also a physician, and he encouraged her to publicise her case. And that year, so this is a very moving account of what happens to her, is published in the Lancet ad verbatim. For Newell, that her account might be published and possibly encourage others who had undergone similar experiences to speak out was of vital importance. As she concluded, "Whoever, I presume, is in possession of liberty, with the power of exercising their reason and speech, should omit no opportunity of bringing to light, through those faculties and by the use of their pen and the aid of the press, these disgraceful proceedings." And it does seem that Newell's case did have an impact. It would later be taken up by a group known as the Alleged Lunatics Friends Society, who are actually a relatively powerful group of people who were beaten asylums, and they were campaigning against unjust imprisonment in those asylums, and actually had a number of influential supporters in politics and medicine, like Thomas Wakeley, among others. And then the second one I just wanted to have a look at is one from the homeopathic journals. And I think the homeopathic line will be something, will be quite an important aspect of looking at citizen medicine in the 19th century. Homeopathy was introduced in Britain in the mid-19th century. It occupied a rather curious position in Victorian culture, so you had a number of high-profile medical practitioners who also were interested in homeopathy. They were very keen to highlight their scientific credentials, but were for the most part excluded from what you would call orthodox medical culture. So in the mid-decades, you have the emergence of medical periodicals who were very much like the orthodox medical periodicals in terms of layout and content, but were created by homeopathists. So that was a sort of alternative vehicle for lay people. And what's striking is the interaction between lay people and homeopathic doctors in these journals. There's a huge amount of correspondence and contributions from those who were not medically qualified. So I think what we're seeing here is because homeopaths were excluded from orthodox medicine, they were being brought closer to the lay people, and so you see much more interaction within the pages of their journals. And this is one example of a lady writing in anonymously as mater familias, voicing her experience of wearing a poisonous green dress. So this is a reference to a dress that had been dipped in arsenic and was thus poisonous. And so you're seeing a real contribution to knowledge here, because the fears around arsenic and arsenic in green dye and green dresses was kind of building up and accumulating at this time. And so experiences like this were actually very important. So I just want to conclude briefly. So my research is obviously in its early days, but it seems likely to me that in the 19th century, the relationship between the medical profession and the public was by no means just top-down dissemination. The material printed in the medical periodicals was often read, responded to, and even contributed by lay people. So what can we take from these instances of citizen medicine? While in some senses medical knowledge today is more accessible and more available to the public than ever before, other difficulties remain and have perhaps intensified. So the opaque and rather technical language of modern medicine, for instance, can have an alienating effect on those who aren't medically trained, and I think sometimes make genuine engagement quite difficult. Furthermore, while the Lancet of 1823 strove to be available to all in the realm, as you can see indicated there, the periodical today in its mission statement suggests a shift away from this objective. So you can see here that the Lancet now is very much a physician-orientated journal. As open access practices sweep across the publishing world, as the patient-practitioner relationship continues to transform, I think we're going to see lots of changes in the near future. But it seems important to bear in mind that the relationship between the medical profession and the public is always a symbiotic one. And over the course of this project, I hope to find out how this relationship functioned during the 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you. And the modern day equivalent of citizen surgery does exist. I think there's a group in the University of Washington in the US that are using citizen scientists to judge the accuracy of trainee surgeons. Not operating on the citizen scientists quite yet, but perhaps it will come. Our third and final speaker, I'm pleased to tell you, must be setting some sort of record, having begun work on the Creating Scientific Communities project on Tuesday. But luckily, he has a distinguished background studying all sorts of things, primarily as a historian of photography, and with extensive work on the Darwin and Tyndall correspondence projects. So delighted to welcome from Leicester, Dr. Jeff Belknap.
Well, thank you very much. So I want to take us distinctly back to Darwin and distinctly to the mid-Victorian period. And really in this presentation, I want to look at Darwin's use of photographic portraits, particularly in his letter correspondence, as a case study, really, for how we can think about visual objects as both material and representational items which help to construct and maintain a scientific network, and really by extension how various audiences were given access to this scientific community through this mode of communication. And this is going to take a set of arguments. The first really is that Darwin's photographic portraits, both the ones that he sent out and the ones that he received, were intended explicitly to create and reinforce his scientific network. And that unlike letters that were carried along with these, the portraits carry a very different material presence. And this really changes how they were kept, which I'll talk about soon, and how they were reread as objects. In correlation to this, when we're thinking about these visual objects, what happened to them, how they were displayed, really becomes the linchpin here. Whether they were hung onto a wall, put into an album, made into a scrapbook, these all really create different forms of relationship between the image and its meaning. And I think if we can help deconstruct these forms of display, we can really help deconstruct the meaning of the images themselves. And then finally, by examining Darwin's exchange of photographs, we can try to figure out or evaluate a different avenue of public access and participation in science and scientific culture, which is often overlooked. And what I want to do in this is, instead of doing an explicit case study with examples, I want to put forward a methodology of looking, really. How I'm going to do this is look particularly at photos, but all of these photographs, I want to say, come from the Darwin Correspondence letter set, which is on the Darwin Correspondence website. So there's 15,000 letters there, and all of these references to photographs come from that. So it's a fairly narrow scope, I think, but it reflects the kind of research we can do with correspondence. It's not complete, but I think it's representative. But it also represents the kind of work I will continue to do with periodicals as the focus on the Citizen Science Project. So let's talk a little bit about what is special about the photographic portrait. Why focus on photographs? Well, this is for two primary reasons. When Darwin sent his portrait, it was entirely unlike sending any other form of image or text, really. And this is for two reasons. First is that the photograph is embedded with a certain level of verisimilitude, a certain authenticity, not a complete, but it is valued as a different way or a more valuable way of seeing and knowing someone. And the second is there's a very large culture of photographic image exchange, consumption, reproduction, buying in the 19th century that Darwin is certainly buying into here. But when we look at Darwin's correspondence in particular, we need to remember that these images for him are very much an aspect of the production of his celebrity. And this comes through in the fact that many of his photographic portraits get widely sold through periodical presses, reproductions in his own books, but also if we look at the correspondence themselves, many of these pictures came with signatures on them or signatures in the letter. So again, there's a big correlation between celebrity here and the visual object. Now, when we look at what people wrote about these letters and what people wrote about the images, we can see a set of correlated aspects. And the first is that photographs for his correspondence were a central aspect in showing a time past or their experiences with Darwin himself. So in 1863, one of Darwin's old shipmates on the Beagle voyage, Philip Gedley King, who happened to be living in Australia at this point, wrote to Darwin after having received a photograph from him. And he writes and says, "You cannot think with what pleasure I received a note from you by the last mail enclosing a photograph of yourself. It was a strange feeling that came over me as I identified one by one the now well-remembered features of what you must permit me to call your dear old face. And as I gaze upon your likeness, reminiscences of my youth appear to come back to me. I fancy I see you in your old corner behind the mizzenmast, with neither room to bend nor turn, still pursuing your studies in natural history with unwonted zeal. But I will not bore you with such reminiscences. Suffice it to say that few things have given me greater pleasure lately than the opportunity you have given me of reproducing in my mind's eye the very expression of your eye and your mouth." So again, this is very much an aspect of recalling for these individuals what Darwin is like. And again, for many of his correspondents, a photograph allows them to show that they have a familiarity with who Darwin was, and also vice versa. Darwin can say, "I know who you are." So in one example, in a letter from his very good close friend Joseph Dalton Hooker, who was the botanist at Kew, Hooker writes to Darwin in 1864 after receiving a photograph and says, "Your photograph tells me where Herbert got his Moses for the fresco in the House of Lords. Horns, halos, and all. Well done, William," who's Darwin's son, which had produced the picture. "Your mouth comes out funnily like F. Wedgwood's. Do pray send me one for Thwaites, who will be enchanted with it. Oliver is calling out for one too." So really, ultimately, all of these images and these photographic portraits were proof of a scientific friendship. And this term scientific friendship begs a number of questions. And the first is really, what's the difference between a scientific friendship and a friend? And I think for Darwin, all of his friends were scientific friends. He utilized them all for the same purpose. But I think there's also a difference between having a letter from Darwin and having a photograph. And I think this will come back to what people did with those photographic images, how they displayed them. And finally, I think community building, really, this form of scientific friendship creation is a type of participation in science, or allows for an avenue of thinking about participation in science. So I want to go briefly through what these actual portraits sent by Darwin were. Well, over his lifetime, between 1842 and 1882, when he passed away, he made at least 32 different photographic portraits, or had made, under over 18 different sittings. The first was a daguerreotype with his son William in 1842, and this is really a one-off, standalone kind of image. It was never reproduced. It was always within the family home and never sent to anyone. People would have to come to his home to see him. But over his lifetime, he had two of his sons, William and Leonard, make at least 5 photographic prints of himself. He also had 4 photographic studios, which are the Mull and Polyblank on the left were the first. Elliott and Fried, Baroud of London, were also making photographic prints over his lifetime. He then had 2 very famous photographers come and make portraits of himself. Many of you will know the Julia Margaret Cameron images on the left here. Over a week, she came and spent a week in the Darwin household and took a number of photographic portraits. And then on the right, you have Oscar Rylander, who became a very famous photographer in the Victorian period, known for Jinx Baby, which is the picture of a crying baby. But he was also one of the main photographers for Darwin's only photographic experimental work, which is Expressions and Emotions in Man and Animal. So again, Darwin has a range of photographs and photographic expertise. And finally, he has a set of carte de visites made, which I'll come back to soon. 3 sets made by Ernest Edwards, a famous house in London, Elliott and Fry, and Locke and Whitfield. So what did he end up doing with these photographs? Well, he started to build his network. If we look, or if we trace where these images go, what we see is it actually looks quite like where his letters go, right? So we're talking about around 100 letters here with photographs in them, but when we're talking about Darwin's correspondence, we're talking about 15,000 plus, right? But when we map together, it actually looks like the letters that he sent go to the same places as the letters that he sent out with photographs. There's 26 different countries here, 59 different cities. Look a little bit closer at Europe, and we see the largest conglomeration here that is still quite spread out. You have England, Scotland, Norway, Germany, Netherlands, Switzerland, Estonia, Czech Republic, Belarus, Serbia, just to name a couple. Where did he actually send them to, or how many did he send out? Well, I've been able to trace at least 74 photographs that he sent between 1856 and 1881, and he received 58 photographs. And I want to point out that this will be a low number, because there's a lot of photographs which wouldn't have been either lost in letters that we don't have, or on a personal one-to-one exchange. And when we look at them together, we can actually see quite an interesting corollary. These high points correlate quite directly with the publication of Darwin's biggest monograph. So, the big point there is right after his publications of Origins, and then later ones in the 1870s are correlated to expressions and emotions in Man and Animal and Descent of Man, which were also very popular. So again, he's sending them out as part of his celebrity movement, but also as an essential part in gaining these scientific friends, this scientific network. Okay, so I want to think a little bit now about what it means to have material forms, or to have the images end up in a certain place. So what did these correspondents do with the images? And I want to talk about 3 different material ends, to use a convoluted term, I think. And the first is coming back to carte de visites. The second is looking at photographic albums, and the third, briefly, will be about scrapbooks. So this is just before Darwin has a carte de visite. He actually comes quite late to producing carte de visites. It's not until 1867 that he has his first carte de visite made, which is really the way we think about the largest, a way in which you would exchange a photograph. It's on a hard card, it has your name printed on it, it's meant to be exchanged, unlike a print. And before this, he has, in the early 1860s, he has 2 of his scientific amateur friends writing to him. Henry Johnson was actually a contemporary at Shrewsbury, his school, but became a physician, a very well-known physician, and was also a founding member of the Shropshire Natural History Society. And he writes to Darwin in 1862 and says, if I could know how to procure a photograph or carte de visite of you for love or money, I should be extremely glad. King as well writes, this is a year before he receives the photograph from Darwin, and says, and Darwin writes to him and says, I have no proper carte, but I send a photograph of myself made 3 or 4 years ago by my eldest son, now at a bank, that shows how old I am, and which is a good likeness of me. But what happens when he starts to produce carte de visites is he can start to expand out his network. He can make more and he can send more. One of the first ones, or the first exchanges he has, is really quite interesting. It's with 2 very amateur young naturalists in the Netherlands by the names of Nicholas Dirk Doedes and Jan Kosteris. And these come as a pair. And they start a correspondence in the early 1870s, and Darwin writes to them in 1873 and says, perhaps you would like to possess a photograph of me as a souvenir of our correspondence. I therefore send 2 copies. 2 weeks later, they write back and say, many thanks for your kind letter to us and your fine photograms. You cannot conceive how happy we are with them. Now we assume to send our portrait to you, which has been made expressly for this occasion. If it had been good at once, we should have sent it much sooner. But the first edition was too bad, worse than this. Here we are. The figure on the left is Kosteris. The figure on the right hand is Doedes. The letter you see eternalized before us is your letter. So really this is a striking example in which both the person, the letter in which it's carrying this object, and the photograph all become eternalized and centered in the same object, right? But really, what do we do? What happens when these photographs are sent? What happens when Darwin receives a carte, or when someone else receives a cart from Darwin? Well, what most likely happens is they end up in an album. And I want to focus on one particularly interesting album, which Darwin actually receives by the Dutch Naturalist Society in the Netherlands Zoological Society. And in 1877, Adrian van Bemmel and H. Veth, who are the secretaries for the society, write to Darwin and send him this beautifully velvet encased album of carte de visites. And they're sending it to him because they think it's his 69th birthday. It's 1877, which, if anyone can do the math, it's not actually his 69th birthday, but it also shows that there is a degree of error when we're talking about citizens and we're talking about participation in science. But let's look a little bit closer at this album. It's velvet. It doesn't have an engraving plate or anything. It has an engraving plate, but there's nothing insignia on the front of it. But if we look inside, we see quite a lushly gold-gilt title page. And then inside, these would have been filled with carte de visites, but because of museum collection practices, they've been taken out. There was included 217 separate, distinct carte de visite portraits of individuals from the Netherlands who were interested in Darwin and Darwin's work. There was no specific organization other than that they were alphabetical. So there was no priority of place in terms of who was involved. There were many young naturalists, there were many amateurs, but as we'll see, there were also teachers and a range of people. Two of these individuals happened to be women. The woman on the left was Elise Bart, who was a dramatist, and Madame Ledouvière Bethen Macaire, who's on the right, who is a teacher. And if we look closer at some of the items which were included in this, we see that a description of each of those individual photographs has a name of the person and their occupation. So there is really an inclusion here of a wide variety of people, but also a distinction of who they are and why they would be included. What really becomes interesting is when we look at Darwin's response to this very nice album. I suppose that every worker at science occasionally feels depressed and doubts whether that he has published, what he has published has been worth the labor which it has cost him. But the few remaining years of my life, whenever I want cheering, I will look at the portraits of my distinguished co-workers in the field of science and remember their generous sympathy. When I die, the album will be a most precious bequest to my children. Okay, I want to finally touch on scrapbooks here. And the reason I want to talk about scrapbooks is because scrapbooks become a very explicit and single way in which an individual can reconstruct both a community and create a scientific collection. So I'm borrowing on Jim Secord's notion of scrapbook science, of being able to collate, cut, and paste together a set of practices, a set of knowledge. And there's one particular scrapbook which was in the possession of John Lubbock, who is Darwin's next-door neighbor. And his daughter, Amy Lubbock, made this scrapbook of essentially everyone that came to the house. And in the middle of it, we find a delightful picture of Darwin. But when we look closer, we can see specific signs of organization. She's framed it. There's captioning. So there's very specific organizational, relational objects here. And then if we look on the opposite page, directly across from it, you see that Darwin's signature is also associated here, which would have been collected at a separate time, but obviously has a relational importance. I want to come now very briefly to some conclusions. So what, again, can this tell us about citizen science, and what can this tell us about a larger notion of visual imagery and the communication of science? Well, the first thing is that there is a real problem with the photographic archives and the problems of letters, that all of these, in my methodology, all of these images which I've been talking about are not images, but they're textual traces. So they're all things that have been talked about as images and become discussions of images. And I think there's a problem there, or there's a way of access that we can start to use. There's also a need for really a deeper study of the reproduction of photographs, or really any other type of image production in communication contexts. Thirdly, I think that there is a key difference here between the photographic and the non-photographic image, which is what I'll bring forward in my future work on the notion of periodical and image reproduction. And finally, I want to point out that Darwin as a correspondent really is unique in certain senses, but the relationship between photographs and letters is really not. And that I think if we understand this relationship, we can help access a process of scientific communication and participation, really, that is typically overlooked. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you for that, and thanks to all of our speakers. I don't know if you want to cluster awkwardly around the podium for the discussion session. I think that will probably work best. We do have a roving microphone, and this is being webcast, so if you have a question, then please wait for the microphone to get to you. Who wants to start us off? Brooke.
It's a question for Sally Shuttleworth.
Yes.
I remember on one of your slides there was a quote about how the volunteers for the rainfall collection knew each other better than they knew the lead. Does that imply that there was some kind of socialization amongst the volunteers that the project had brought them together? They might not have come together before.
Yes, I think in local areas that there was association, but yes, as it suggested, they never met or quite often would not have met their leader at all, but operated in this network through the periodical and through sending their materials. But yes, there was a lot of local organisation, as I was suggesting, the sanitary networks as well, and so things that had to be recorded increased constantly during the century, and it created, yes, a sense of camaraderie, I think, and mutual dedication to pursuit of knowledge.
Who's next? Yeah, down at the front here. Sorry, just wait for the mic. Sorry.
I guess the question I have could apply to all three of you, but I thought of it in particular during Sally Frampton's talk. And this comes from the Lancet's founding, sort of the preface that you showed, and it said that it was mainly, I guess it applied to medical and surgical practitioners of the city, to the country, practitioners to the colonial ones, and to the students, and then everyone else. So is there sort of a class and maybe sort of empire aspect to the citizens of science, sort of who could participate, do you think?
Yeah. I think there's lots of layers in Thomas Wakeley's statement there, because obviously there's divides between the city and the provinces as well, with the more elite practitioners in the city, and I guess there's this idea that those who are in the colonies are perhaps not doing the most innovative work and things like that. But certainly there are layers there, and it's quite hard to read what he's saying, whether the and everyone in the realm is sort of afterthought, or whether that's a really important part of his philosophy. So it's something I really need to look at. And indeed, even if that was his idea, whether people were actually responding to that, whether they could even access the medical periodical, both in terms of being abroad and in the public more generally. So yeah, it's an interesting question. There's a lot of different ways you could read it, I think.
And missionaries played a huge role in the exploring both local natural history and also in medical practice in sort of empire. So yes, it's very interesting. And the other aspect is the collectors who go out, who are often sort of lower middle class at best, going out to make their fortune by finding all these specimens. So it was a complete spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely. The networks of empire, I think, are absolutely essential to Darwin, certainly just in logistical aspects of the postal system, but also in very much he needs to have these correspondents who are spread throughout the globe in order to get the most effective and the most accurate data. And in the same way, he's sending out portraits in order to establish and mobilize these communities, I think. And, just outside of Darwin, there's lots of, I think, corollaries in the 19th century to the importance of local communities. I'm thinking of ethnological studies by Huxley, or of Galton's really work, where he sends out lots of questionnaires, and it's necessary to go out into the empire, and it's necessary to get local inhabitants and local practitioners, really.
There's a question down here at the front.
Thanks. I'm thinking about Professor Hackley at UCL, who will be speaking here later. And as we know, he's promoting this extreme citizen science, which seems to me to be activist citizen science, at least a lot of it. And as we're discussing these different initiatives back in Victorian times, I suddenly thought there were lots of mass campaigns through the century on political and social issues. Was there ever a case where citizens did that sort of science of gathering data in order to make a case? I'm I mean, now I'm wondering, how did Chadwick get his information? Did he pay people, did he have employees who went from house to house, or was he actually enlisting citizens to do that?
I think it's a mixture. The public health officers, once they're established, but also if you look at the periodicals, you get the writing in of people, and some of them are doctors, and a lot are obviously just private individuals. So yes, it spreads very widely, though obviously the use that's made of it is then quite interesting, because you would not initially put Chadwick on the side of the angels, but I think he passes over.
I could just add that things like the anti-vaccination movement were obviously embedded in a political context. People who are involved in that were often involved in other political campaigns and involved in things like vegetarianism, teetotalism, things like that. So certainly you can embed it in a broader political context, I think.
But then there were anti-vaccinators in the same sort of campaigns.
Yes, in those campaigns, yes.
So it's almost like the reforming activist movement was split on vaccination.
Yeah, there's a lot of crossover with the vaccination, certainly, and also you had some anti-vaccinators within the medical profession as well. So yeah.
Anyone else? At the back. Sorry,
Hi, being Scottish, I'd like to go back to the rainfall. Were there any signs that any of the people who took part in that study went above and beyond what they were asked to do? Rather than just taking the rain measurements, did any of them want to know more about the study as a whole, or did they collect any other weather information and send it back that was extra to what they were asked?
Our records are patchy, and it's something that I'd very much like to explore, but I believe, yes, very much so, and rather in parallel to what's happening in Zooniverse with the astronomers who start off knowing very little and then start to train themselves, and I think this very much happened with meteorology. They didn't just take the records, they read the periodicals, they corresponded, they developed interests that spread more widely, and I think then joined local societies, so it became a real sort of self-education movement, I think, and wasn't simply sort of taking measurements for the sake of measurements.
Right.
So I think we have time certainly for one more, if there is one. Otherwise, yeah.
I wanted to ask about the techniques of verification that were used and are used in terms of what the citizen scientists submit. As to, for example, how do people who organize these networks know that what they're getting is what they want to get and is trustworthy? Because in expert science, so to speak, we have and had established techniques such as peer review now, but what about citizen science?
I answer on the rainfall, because this was the debate between Glaisher and Simmons, because Glaisher says, I want my fully trained observers, because I will know precisely what gauge they've used and how they have followed the rules, whereas Simmons tried to go for a simpler system. But you've probably noticed he did allow them to use different forms of gauges, and so then you get the debate, is this sort of opening it up so that it's not going to be trustworthy data? And so there was always this tension between, do you have the controlled few, or do you open it up and then raise the question of whether some of the data just might not be sufficiently trustworthy? But then it falls upon Simmons himself to decide how much whether there are people who are so outliers they're likely not to be trustworthy, and I think this is accounted for electronically, isn't it, in the Zooniverse system, where you rule out those who are not seem to be an outlier in results.
Yeah, we have an easier task than Simmons, because we're looking at data that's being collected and showing it to people, so we just could repeat classification to get a sense of consensus that way. I think it's interesting in both cases, though, the results are mediated by a professional scientist who communicates to the professional community what the citizens have done.
I think that one of the main, I guess, tasks of the project over the next ensuing 3 years will be really to situate for the Victorian period where authority lies, or where this trust lies, right? Because it's for the Victorians, really, it's a shifting boundary. I mean, when we're talking about Darwin, are we talking about an amateur scientist? I mean, to certain degrees we are. He's certainly not at an institution, but he invests his authority through his scrutinizing very small details and collecting these details. And I think the interesting thing for this project will be think about, well, how do we have these large collection of data through citizens? Does it need to go through a conduit? And what is that conduit? Who is the mediator? And what are those processes? And I think that's where we can really think about, citizen science, communication of science, lay participation.
Well, that seems like an excellent note to end on. So let's thank our speakers again.